Javier Valdez Cardenas. In May of 2017, a cartel boss offered 100,000 pesos to have a journalist killed in Culiacan, Sinaloa. That amount, roughly $5,000 at the time, was the price placed on the life of one of Mexico's most respected reporters. The man who put up the money would eventually walk free in the United States under a cooperator deal. The journalist would not survive the week. It was 2003, and Javier Valdez Cardenas was building something dangerous. Along with a small team of journalists in Culiacan, he co-founded Rio Doce, a weekly newspaper that would become the most authoritative independent voice covering the Sinaloa Cartel in all of Mexico. Valdez was a sociology graduate from the Autonomous University of Sinaloa, who had already spent years as the La Jornada correspondent in the state, covering the cartel from the streets of the city where its leaders lived, dined, and settled their disputes with gunfire. He had written books with titles that told you everything about his beat. Miss Narco, Los Morros del Narco, Con una granada en la boca, which translates to with a grenade in your mouth, Narco Periodismo, Huérfanos del Narco. He was not writing from a distance. He was writing from inside the machine. In 2011, the Committee to Protect Journalists gave him their International Press Freedom Award. That same year, Rio Doce's team received Columbia University's Maria Moore's Cabot Prize. Standing at a podium in New York, Valdez told the audience that he had written about the tragedy Mexico was living, a tragedy that should shame them all, and that the youth would remember this era as a time of war, their DNA tattooed with bullets and blood. He was not speaking in metaphor. In 2009, someone had already thrown a fragmentation grenade at Rio Doce's offices after the magazine published a series on Ciudad Juarez hitmen. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was ever identified. By early 2017, the threats had become personal. Valdez told the Committee to Protect Journalists in March that he was concerned for his safety. The trigger was the civil war inside the Sinaloa Cartel itself. In January of 2017, El Chapo Guzman was extradited to the United States, and his absence split the organization in half. On one side were Los Chapitos, his sons. On the other was Damaso Lopez Núñez, known as El Licenciado, and his son Damaso Lopez Serrano, known as El Minilik. Valdez reported on all of it. In February, Rio Doce published an interview with El Licenciado. On May 7th, Valdez ran a column mocking Minilik as a weekend gunman who paled next to his father. 8 days later, Valdez was dead. On May 15, 2017, around noon, Valdez left a meeting at Rio Doce's offices. Gunmen blocked his red car a block away. Witnesses said they ordered him to kneel. He was shot at least 12 times with 9mm rounds, then dragged from the vehicle. His laptop and phone were taken. He was 50 years old. The state attorney general confirmed the details at the scene and said his department would provide more protection for journalists. President Enrique Peña Nieto posted condolences and reiterated his commitment to freedom of expression and the press. According to testimony presented during the trial, Minilik had first offered a different sicario 100,000 pesos to carry out the killing. That man refused. Minilik then recruited the Picos cousins, and as a reward for completing the hit, the killers received a silver pistol engraved with images of El Licenciado and Minilik. The investigation produced 3 named gunmen. Heriberto Picos Barraza, known as El Koala, was the driver. Juan Francisco Picos Barrueta, known as El Quillo, was the shooter and cell leader. A third man, Luis Ildefonso Sanchez Romero, known as El Diablo, was also identified as a shooter, but his charred body was found in a burned vehicle in Sonora in September of that year, before he could be arrested. El Koala was captured in Tijuana in April of 2018. He was sentenced to 14 years and 8 months. El Cuyo refused a plea deal of 20 years and 8 months because he had previously been offered the lower sentence. He went to trial. On June 17, 2021, he was sentenced to 32 years and 3 months. And then there was the man who ordered it. A federal arrest warrant for Minnie Lick as the intellectual author was issued in January of 2020. But he had already surrendered to U.S. immigration in California back in July of 2017 and become a DEA cooperator. In September of 2022, a U.S. federal judge sentenced him to 72 months, time he had already served, and effectively released him to a witness protection track. Mexico's extradition request remains formally pending and unfulfilled. Valdez's widow, Griselda Triana, posted on social media after the release. She wrote that the man who paid 100,000 pesos to have her husband murdered was now free and working for the American government, and she called on people not to allow it. The Committee to Protect Journalists Mexico representative called the convictions of the gunman an important step, but said authorities must pursue Minnie Lick's extradition so he can be tried in Mexico. 2 days after Valdez was killed, another journalist named Miroslava Breach had already been dead for 8 weeks. Before she died, Valdez had written a tribute to her that became his own epitaph. He wrote that they killed Miroslava for speaking out, and that if that was the death sentence for reporting in this hell, then let them kill every journalist. They killed him next, and the man who ordered it is free. The Journalist Consortium Forbidden Stories and the German newspaper. Die Zeit continued Valdez's unfinished reporting through what they called the Cartel Project. Rio Doce is still publishing. The people who worked with Valdez are still writing. But the man who paid to stop them walked out of a U.S. federal courtroom and into witness protection. The Concordia Bridge Children. If you trace the Sinaloa Cartel's modern brutality back far enough, it leads to a single act of revenge in 1989. It did not happen in Mexico. It happened on a bridge in Venezuela, and the victims were a 5-year-old boy and his 4-year-old sister. Hector Luis Palma Salazar, known as El Güero, was born in Mocorito, Sinaloa, on April 29, 1960. By the late 1980s, he was a co-leader with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman of the Sinaloa faction of the crumbling Guadalajara cartel. The cartel had been the dominant trafficking organization in Mexico for most of the decade. But its patriarch, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, was arrested in April of 1989 for his role in the murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena. The arrest shattered the organization. Territory that had been shared under a single umbrella was suddenly up for grabs, and the Tijuana-based Arellano Félix brothers, Felix Gallardo's nephews, decided that Palma would not survive the transition. They sent a Venezuelan operative named Enrique Rafael Clavel Moreno. Clavel had previously dated Palma's sister Minerva, which gave him proximity to the family that an outsider would never have had. He used that access to reach Palma's wife, Guadalupe Leja Serrano. Over a period of weeks, he seduced her. He convinced her to withdraw $7 million from a bank account in San Diego. Then he took her and the couple's 2 young children, Jesus Hector and Natalie, across the border and out of Mexico entirely. What followed is considered the founding atrocity of the modern Sinaloa cartel. Clavel took the life of Guadalupe Leja Serrano. She was reportedly the first person connected to Mexican drug trafficking to be killed by beheading, and her remains were sent to Palma in Sinaloa. The scope of that act alone would have been enough to start a war. But Clavel was not finished. Weeks later, he flew with the 2 children to San Cristobal in the state of Táchira, Venezuela, roughly 40 kilometers from the Colombian border. On the Puente de la Concordia, both children were harmed fatally. Jesus Hector was 5 years old, Natalie was 4, and no, I'm not making that up. This was not a war zone atrocity or the byproduct of a firefight. It was deliberate, premeditated, and carried out against 2 children who had no involvement in any dispute. What the children endured on that bridge was described in records as an act so extreme it redefined the boundaries of cartel violence for an entire generation. The Arellano Felix brothers had sent a message. The message was that there were no limits. Palma's response shaped everything that came after. He ordered the killing of Felix Gallardo's lawyer. He ordered the deaths of Clavel's own children. He later had Clavel himself murdered inside a Venezuelan prison cell. Each act of retaliation invited another, and each escalation made the previous one look restrained by comparison. The Tijuana-Sinaloa War that erupted between 1992 and 93 flowed directly from this sequence, and it established a cycle so extreme that it became the template for every cartel conflict that followed. Before the Puente de la Concordia, cartel violence in Mexico had boundaries, even if those boundaries were loose. After it, there were none. The idea that a rival's family, including children, could be targeted as leverage was no longer theoretical. It had been executed, literally, on a bridge in Venezuela. The collateral damage extended beyond the cartels themselves. In Culiacan, a civil rights attorney named Norma Corona Sapien, who had founded the Sinaloa Human Rights Commission, was assassinated on May 21, 1990. She was killed allegedly because she had documented the chain of murders connecting Palma and Clavel. She had kept records that no one in the government wanted to exist. Her case has never been resolved. Another life ended because someone tried to write down what happened. The 2 Palma children are buried in a family mausoleum at the Panteón Jardines del Humaya in Culiacan, the cemetery where narco kingpins build elaborate marble tombs with air conditioning and music systems inside. Their father was arrested in June of 1995 after a plane crash in Jalisco. He was extradited to the United States in 2007, deported back to Mexico on June 10, 2016, and as of this recording remains incarcerated at the Altiplano Federal Prison. The man who lost his wife and children to an act of revenge that crossed 2 international borders spent the rest of his life behind bars or on the run. Clavel is dead. The Arellano Felix brothers were eventually captured or killed over the following 2 decades. The only people in this story who never had a chance were the 2 children on that bridge. The Puente de la Concordia is still standing in San Cristobal, Venezuela. It is an ordinary bridge over ordinary water in a city that barely registers on the global map. But in the history of the Sinaloa Cartel, it is ground zero. Every beheading, every hanging, every narco manta left on an overpass in the decades that followed traces its lineage, in one way or another, back to what happened on that bridge in 1989. 2 children who had no part in any of it became the opening casualties of a war that has not ended in over 35 years. But the Sinaloa Cartel did not only consume the people who fought it. It consumed the people who lived near it, who dated its members, who happened to be beautiful in a state where beauty and brutality existed side by side. Maria Susana Flores Gomez. On the morning of November 24, 2012, Mexican Army Special Forces responded to a tip about an illegal checkpoint in the Sierra Madre foothills of Sinaloa. When they arrived, a firefight broke out, When it was over, among the dead was a 22-year-old beauty queen with an AK-47 lying 80 centimeters from her body. Whether she fired it remains unresolved to this day. 5 years before that morning, Maria Susana Flores Gomez was a communications student in Culiacan who entered every pageant she could find. She had been competing since she was a child. She won a regional modeling title at the age of 10. By 2009, she was crowned Modelo Sinaloa. In March of 2012, she won Miss Turismo Oriental International in China. On February 18th of that same year, she was crowned Mujer Sinaloa 2012. At the ceremony, she told the audience that a woman cannot change her past, no matter how hard she tries, but she can choose today what her future will be. She was not starting from nothing. Her father, Mario Flores, had been murdered in 1998 when she was 8. Gunmen sprayed his car while he was driving with his wife beside him. He was 35. The case was never solved. Around 2002, the entire Flores Gomez family was kidnapped. Her mother and a sister were released to negotiate. A brother was held for 3 weeks. The family relocated to Culiacan after that. This is the world she came from. In Sinaloa, violence is not background noise. It is the infrastructure. In 2011, rumors began circulating that Flores Gomez was dating Orso Ivan Gastelum Cruz, known as El Cholo Ivan, the Sinaloa Cartel plaza chief for the Evora region covering Guamuchil, Mocorito, and Salvador Alvarado. El Cholo Ivan was one of El Chapo Guzman's most violent enforcers. He had escaped Aguaruta prison in 2009, disguised as a woman after throwing a party with prostitutes inside his own cell. He was not the kind of man who lived quietly. After Flores Gomez was announced as a pageant contestant, an anonymous post appeared on the Miss Sinaloa Facebook page stating that everyone in Guamuchil knew she was dating a hitman named Ivan, also known as El Cholo, and that he had killed a lot of people. Nobody investigated it. Nobody pulled her aside. The post just sat there on a public Facebook page, and the pageant continued. On November 23, 2012, she told her mother she was driving to Guamuchil for her cousin's birthday. The next morning, around 5:30 a.m., in the village of El Palmar de los Leal in Mocorito municipality, a Special Forces Army unit responded to a 9:30 p.m. tip about an illegal checkpoint set up by armed men in K-Team. The area was a disputed boundary between El Cholo Ivan and a rival trafficker. Soldiers found pickup trucks parked at a safe house guarded by armed men. A firefight erupted. One gunman was killed. A convoy of pickups tried to flee. The white truck carrying Flores Games stopped to allow a second vehicle, the one carrying El Cholo Ivan, to escape into the Sierra Madre. According to neighbors, she jumped from the truck in a yellow blouse and black leggings, holding an AK-47, and screamed for them not to shoot. She was struck in the collarbone. The round severed her left carotid artery. She bled out in 3 minutes. 4 men were arrested at the scene with assault rifles. 2 other gunmen and 1 soldier also died. The federal autopsy documented the cause of death. The state attorney general initially declined to say whether she had fired the weapon. The case was transferred to the federal attorney general's office, where a sodium rhodizonate test on her hands came back positive for barium and lead, which is the standard chemical signature of recent gunshot residue. The AK-47 was found 80 centimeters from her body and was attributed to her. But that was not the whole picture. The Army's first written report stated she carried a firearm but did not say she fired it. No soldier visually confirmed she pulled the trigger. And sodium rhodizonate testing, while standard, is not 100% specific. False positives from environmental lead exposure are documented in forensic literature. The general who oversaw the operation told reporters he thought the situation was being exaggerated and that he could not confirm whether she had fired. In 2009, 3 years before her death, Mexican director Gerardo Naranjo had released a film called Miss Bala. It told a fictionalized version of exactly this trajectory: a beauty queen pulled into the orbit of a cartel and destroyed by it. When Flores Games died, that film became a reference point for every story written about her. The fiction had preceded the reality. She was buried in Guamuchil in a strapless green sequined gown with her crown and scepter. Her mother expanded the family mausoleum with glass lamps and a red suede throne. At the funeral, her mother told reporters that she never could have imagined, not in her entire life, that her daughter would die this way. Hostage, girlfriend, or sicaria. The case never produced a final answer. El Cholo Ivan was finally captured alongside El Chapo in Los Mochis on January 8, 2016. Maria Susana Flores Gomez remains the most cited example of what Mexican media calls the narco beauty queen phenomenon. She was 22 years old, and the only certainty about her death is that the man she was with escaped while she did not. But Flores Games at least had a name in the headlines. The cartel's other victims, the fathers and mothers searching for their disappeared children, were invisible until they forced their way in front of a camera or a president. Nepomuceno Moreno Núñez. On October 14, 2011, inside Chapultepec Castle in Mexico City, a 56-year-old father from Sonora interrupted a dialogue between a national peace movement and the President of Mexico. He walked to the podium, handed President Felipe Calderón a folder of evidence, and told him directly that he was searching for his son and that he had received death threats. Calderón took the folder and told him he would look into it. 45 days later, Nepomuceno Moreno Núñez was shot dead in broad daylight, meters from the Sonora State Attorney General's office. If you had asked anyone in the Movimiento por la Paz con Justicia y Dignidad about Don Nepo in the summer of 2011, they would have told you he was the bravest man they had ever met. They had no idea he would be dead before the year was out. Don Nepo was a small business owner in Sonora with a complicated history. He had a 1979 U.S. heroin smuggling conviction in Arizona and a 2005 arrest in Sonora for possession of military-grade firearms, though he was acquitted in 2009. None of that is what defined him. What defined him was July 1, 2010. That was the day his 18-year-old son, Jorge Mario Moreno León, disappeared on the Guaymas to Ciudad Obregón highway, along with 3 friends. Don Nepo's video testimony, posted to YouTube and the Movimiento por la Paz website, laid out what he believed happened. He said state police had abducted his son and the 3 friends, that he had paid a ransom, and that police had removed the convenience store surveillance footage from the case file. The bodies of 2 of the friends were eventually found. Jorge Mario was never recovered. For 10 months, Don Nepo walked the streets of Hermosillo alone, carrying photocopies of his son's photograph. In May of 2011, he joined the Movimiento por la Paz con Justicia y Dignidad, the peace movement founded by poet Javier Sicilia after Cecilia's own son was murdered in March of that year. Don Nepo marched in the first caravan from Cuernavaca to Mexico City. He joined the Caravana del Consuelo to the northern border. He participated in the Caravana al Sur to Guatemala. He carried a homemade folder with all the evidence on his son's case everywhere he went. Then came the Chapultepec Castle meeting. The moment was captured on video, Don Nepo stood in front of the president of Mexico and told him he was looking for his son and that people were threatening to kill him. Calderón told him he would handle it. Don Nepo went home believing something would change. Nothing changed. On November 4th, 2011, Don Nepo wrote an email to his allies in the movement. He told them to be aware that at any moment they could disappear him or kill him. He said he was not afraid, that he had sworn to his son he would not abandon the search, and that soldiers had slept in front of his house the night before, watching over the family. The next day, November 5th, he wrote again. He said he had identified 3 of his son's killers, and that this bomb was about to explode. 23 days later, on November 28th, 2011, around 12:15 in the afternoon, Don Nepo was driving a 1997 blue Chevrolet pickup through the intersection of Avenida Reforma and Ignacio Pesquera in the Centenario neighborhood of Hermosillo. A lone gunman shot him at least 7 times with a .40 caliber pistol. He was meters from the state attorney general's building. 7 shell casings were recovered at the scene. The Sonora state spokesman told reporters that Don Nepo's death was principally tied to organized crime and cited his old criminal record as context. The movement and Amnesty International rejected that framing entirely. The Movimiento por la Paz issued a statement holding federal and state authorities responsible by omission for a death they had been warned about repeatedly. A spokesperson for the movement called the killing a message not only against their organization, but against everyone working through civil and peaceful means. Cecilia, who was at the Guadalajara International Book Fair when he heard the news, called it the chronicle of an announced assassination. Amnesty International issued an urgent action notice within days. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Not before it was too late. Subsequent investigations pointed to Alfredo Salazar Ramirez, known as El Muñeco, of Los Salazar, the Sinaloa Cartel cell operating in Sonora, Chihuahua, as the gunman. Investigators also tied detained members of Los Salazar both to Jorge Mario's original kidnapping and to Don Nepo's assassination, which meant the same criminal network that had taken his son had come back to silence the father. Don Nepo's family fled Sonora the day he was murdered. They lived in exile for years under federal protection. His case was never fully prosecuted. He is regarded today, alongside other activists murdered in the movement's first year, as a founding martyr of Mexico's Buscador movement, the network of mothers and fathers who search for their disappeared. As of 2026, that movement has documented over 132,000 disappeared persons across Mexico. Don Nepo handed the president of his country a folder full of evidence, looked him in the eye, and told him he was a dead man walking. The president told him he would look into it. 45 days later, Don Nepo was killed on a street named Reforma, a few steps from the building that was supposed to protect him. Los Salazar, the cartel cell that killed Don Nepo, was not done. That same network, operating across the Sonora-Chihuahua border, had another name on its list. This time it was a journalist, Miroslava Breach Velducia. On March 23, 2017, a gunman left a piece of cardboard next to a bullet-riddled SUV in the Granjas neighborhood of Chihuahua City. The note read that the victim was killed for talking too much, and it was signed by L80, the head of the Juarez cartel's enforcement arm. The note was a lie. Investigators would eventually determine that L80 had nothing to do with it. The people who actually ordered the killing were the same cartel operatives the dead woman had spent years exposing in print. But this story does not start with a cardboard note on a sidewalk. It starts in the Sierra Tarahumara, one of the most lawless mountain ranges in the Western Hemisphere, and with a journalist who refused to pretend it was anything else. Miroslava Brejc Velduceja was born on August 7, 1962, in Chinipas, a remote municipality deep in Chihuahua's Sierra Tarahumara. Her father died when she was young. She was raised between Los Mochis, Sinaloa, and Navajoa, Sonora. By 2017, she had been the Chihuahua correspondent for the national daily La Jornada for 20 years. She also wrote columns for El Norte de Chihuahua and served as editorial director of El Norte de Ciudad Juárez. A single mother of two, she had built her reputation on the stories no one else would take. Human rights violations against Rarámuri indigenous communities, illegal logging operations in the Sierra, femicide and forced disappearances in Ciudad Juárez. But the reporting that got her killed was something more specific than any of that. Brejc had documented, with names and dates, how the Sinaloa Cartel's Salazar gang had infiltrated municipal elections across Chihuahua's mountain towns. On March 4, 2016, La Jornada published her piece exposing that cartel members had embedded themselves in the PRI and PAN mayoral slates in narco corridors throughout the Sierra. Her reporting on Chinipas mayoral candidate Juan Miguel Salazar's alleged Sinaloa cartel connections cost him the election. She also broke the story that former Chihuahua Governor Cesar Duarte Jaquez had embezzled 900 million pesos through a private network. According to a journalist colleague who spoke to the Committee to Protect Journalists, she had been threatened on at least 3 prior occasions. This decision, the decision to name the names, would cost her everything. On March 23, 2017, at 7:06 in the morning, Brejc was sitting in the driver's seat of her Renault Duster, parked outside her house at the corner of Rio Aros and Jose Maria Mata. She was waiting to take her 14-year-old son, Carlos, to school. A man in a black hooded sweatshirt, between 175 and 180 meters tall, appeared on neighborhood security camera footage. He walked to the front of the SUV and fired 2 9mm rounds through the windshield. He moved to the driver's side and fired again. Then he walked behind the vehicle and fired a final volley. 8 shots in all. 4 of them hit her in the head. Carlos was in the passenger seat. He was not hurt. Miroslava died on the way to the hospital. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Chihuahua Governor Javier Corral Jurado decreed 3 days of mourning, though he was criticized for having been vacationing in Mazatlan days earlier. The state attorney general told a press conference on March 30th that Brejc had been killed because her reporting affected the interests of organized crime. By October of that year, Governor Corral confirmed that the investigation had attributed the murder to Los Salazares, the Sinaloa Cartel's Gente Nueva faction. The planner was identified as Crispin Salazar Zamorano, and the trigger team was led by his nephew, Juan Miguel Salazar, the same man whose election Brejc's reporting had derailed. And then the investigation produced something unusual for Mexico: actual convictions. Juan Carlos Moreno Ochoa, known as El Larry, was arrested by federal police on Christmas Day, 2017, in Echojoa, Sonora. The actual triggerman, Ramon Andres Zavala Corral, was found dead in El Zapote, Sonora, on December 19, 2017, with a single gunshot to the chest, just days before El Larry's arrest. On March 18, 2020, a federal judge convicted El Larry of qualified homicide. On August 21, 2020, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. That was not a typo, by the way. 50 years. But the case did not stop at the gunman. Hugo Ahmed Schultz Alcaraz, the former mayor of Chinipas, was arrested on December 17, 2020, for complicity. He had passed to the Salazars a recording of a private phone call in which Breach revealed her sources for the mayoral infiltration story. That recording gave the cartel exactly what it needed to justify her murder. On June 15, 2021, Schultz was sentenced to 8 years under an abbreviated trial. The mastermind, Crispin Salazar Zamorano, was formally named by Mexico's special prosecutor for crimes against journalists on February 17, 2020, and remains a fugitive. The getaway driver, Shaciel Vega Villa, also remains at large. The family's lawyer, Victor Martinez of Propuesta Civica, told reporters that arrest warrants were still pending, that the judge had mentioned the driver in the trial, and that a key witness had testified to hearing Crispin Salazar personally order El Larry to carry out the killing. The Committee to Protect Journalists Mexico representative called the convictions good news in a country where the vast majority of deadly crimes against reporters go unpunished, but said authorities must do everything possible to arrest and convict everyone else involved. 2 days after Miroslava was buried, Javier Valdez, the Rio Doce journalist whose story opened this video, posted a tribute that would outlive him. He wrote that they killed Miroslava for having a big mouth, and that if that was the sentence for telling the truth about this hell, then let them come for all of them. 8 weeks later, they came for him. The journalist consortium Proyecto Miroslava, made up of Clip, Forbidden Stories, and Bellingcat, continued her unfinished investigations beginning in 2019. 2 journalists, 2 cartel factions, the same Sinaloa Cartel machine, and the only difference between them was which wing gave the order. But the cartel did not just punish the people who wrote about it, or the people who named its operatives. It also punished the people who snitched from the inside. And nobody learned that lesson harder than a pair of twin brothers from Chicago's South Side. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The Flores twins. In the summer of 2008, somewhere in the mountains of Sinaloa, a pair of identical twins from Chicago sat across from the most wanted drug lord on earth and recorded him on a hidden device. The recording would later be played in a Brooklyn courtroom during the trial of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. On the tape, El Chapo greeted one twin as a friend and asked the other to procure rocket launchers and grenades. Within a year of that meeting, the twins would be cooperating with the DEA, and within 2 years, their father would be presumed dead. Pedro, known as Pete, and Margarito Jr., known as Jay, Flores were born in Chicago in 1981. Their father, Margarito Sr., was an immigrant from Zacatecas who drove a forklift at a candy factory in the Little Village neighborhood while selling heroin on the side. He was arrested 3 months before the twins were born for selling 11 pounds of heroin to an undercover federal agent. Released when the twins were 7, he brought them into the business. As small children, they removed gas tank canisters and packed marijuana on family road trips. Their twin appearance helped distract Border Patrol agents at checkpoints. Their older brother Hector died of a heroin overdose. Another older brother, Armando, became a Latin Kings kingpin in Chicago. By age 17, the twins were doing 30-kilo cocaine deals on their own. By their early 20s, they were moving over a ton a month. Between 2005 and 2008, the twins admitted in their plea agreements to smuggling at least 1,500 kilograms of Sinaloa Cartel cocaine into the United States every month and sending more than $930 million in bulk cash back to Mexico. They were El Chapo's largest single U.S. customer. In 2003, Pete was kidnapped in Mexico by a crew working with a corrupt Chicago police officer. Jay paid roughly $2.4 million in cocaine ransom. Later, El Chapo himself intervened to free Pete from a separate kidnapping, an episode the twins' wives described in their 2017 memoir. By the summer of 2008, the Sinaloa Beltran-Leyva war forced the twins to choose a side or get out entirely. They chose a third option. They contacted U.S. authorities in Milwaukee and offered to cooperate. That clandestine mountain recording, later replayed in federal court, was part of the evidence they provided, and that decision would cost their father his life. When word leaked in mid-2009 that the twins had flipped, the cartel's retaliation went straight for family. The U.S. government had already extracted the twins' mother, wives, and children in December of 2008. But Margarito Flores Sr. refused to leave Mexico. He had bitterly disowned his sons, calling them cowards and warning that they had no idea what the cartel was capable of, that the cartel would kill all of them. He defied the advice of federal agents and his own family and crossed back into Mexico in 2009. He was kidnapped. His burned-out vehicle was found abandoned in the Sinaloa desert. On the windshield was a note telling the twins to shut up, or the cartel would send them his father's head. His body was never recovered. Federal prosecutors stated in their sentencing memorandum that Margarito Flores Sr. is presumed dead. The kidnapping and presumed murder remain uninvestigated by Mexican authorities. On December 18, 2018, Pete Flores testified for 2 days at El Chapo's trial in Brooklyn, identifying Guzman in court and walking the jury through the recorded calls. On July 17, 2019, El Chapo was convicted on all 10 counts and sentenced to life plus 30 years. The twins' recordings had been a centerpiece of the prosecution. The twins themselves had already been sentenced. On January 27, 2015, U.S. District Chief Judge Ruben Castillo gave each of them 14 years, including the 7 they had already served pre-trial. At sentencing, the judge told them that but for their cooperation, they would be leaving with life sentences, and that even though he was not giving them life, they were still leaving with a life sentence. Because every time they started their car for the rest of their lives, they would be wondering whether it was going to start or whether it was going to explode, and somehow it gets worse. In 2021, the twins' wives, Viviana Lopez and Valerie Gaetan, along with 3 other relatives including the older brother Armando, were indicted for laundering millions in drug proceeds. Among the evidence was cash buried under Armando's porch in Round Rock, Texas. Armando pleaded guilty to money laundering conspiracy. Both wives eventually served prison time. Today, Pete lives in suburban anonymity under witness protection. Jay works publicly as Margarito Flores, has appeared on Fox News, has testified before a congressional task force on Mexican cartels, and trains police through a company called Dynamic Police Training while wearing a face mask on television to hide his identity. He has publicly said he has forgiven the man who once kidnapped his brother. Pete has said he worries that they make too much noise when they are together. The Flores case is about a lot of things. A drug empire that moved $930 million. A pair of twins who flipped on the biggest drug lord on the planet. A federal trial that ended in life plus 30 years. But at its center, there is a father who warned his sons what would happen, who was right, and who paid for their decision with his life. His body has never been found. But there are other families in this story. Families who never touched cocaine, who never ran heroin, who never cooperated with anyone. Families who simply lived in the wrong place and refused to be afraid. And the cartel killed them for it. Benjamin LeBaron. On May 2, 2009, armed men kidnapped a 16-year-old boy from a family ranch in the Galeana municipality of Chihuahua, Mexico, and demanded $1 million for his return. His older brother, a 31-year-old pecan farmer and father of 5, organized a caravan of hundreds of people to the state capital, met directly with the governor, and got helicopters, troops, and roadblocks deployed. The boy was released 8 days later, unharmed. 2 months after that, the older brother was dragged from his house in the middle of the night, beaten in front of his children, and shot dead on a dirt road outside of town. How does someone go from winning a kidnapping standoff to being murdered for it in 60 days? That is the story of Benjamin LeBaron. Colonia LeBaron sits in the Galeana municipality of Chihuahua, roughly 200 kilometers south of the U.S. border. It is a Mormon fundamentalist settlement founded by Alma Dayer LeBaron in the 1920s, after the mainstream LDS Church began excommunicating polygamists. By 2009, the community had roughly 3,000 dual citizenship residents, American and Mexican, living on ranches and pecan orchards in a region where the Sinaloa and Juarez cartels were fighting for control of smuggling corridors. The community had its own violent history, including the Ervil LeBaron killings of the 1970s, but by 2009, Benjamin Franklin LeBaron Ray was one of its pillars. He was married to Miriam. They had 5 young sons. On May 2, 2009, his 16-year-old brother Eric was grabbed from the family ranch and held for $1 million ransom. The family refused to pay. As one of Benjamin's brothers later told the Washington Post, they knew that paying would only invite more kidnappings, that it would mean being invaded by the people doing this. Another brother told the Deseret News that giving them what they wanted was like giving them a cookie, because then they would want a glass of milk, and that if they did not take a stand, it would only be a matter of time before it was his child. Benjamin organized the response himself. He rallied hundreds of LeBarons, Mennonites, and members of the LDS Church into a protest caravan to Chihuahua City. He met face-to-face with the governor and state attorney general. The government deployed helicopters and roadblocks. Eric was released 8 days later, unharmed. Separately, 72-year-old Bishop Meredith Romney, a relative of Mitt Romney, was briefly kidnapped from the same area. In June of 2009, 25 alleged gunmen were arrested in connection with extortion in the region, which infuriated local cartel cells that had been profiting from the kidnappings. Benjamin did not stop after Eric's release. He founded an organization called SOS Chihuahua, short for Sociedad Organizada Segura, to push for kidnapping reform. Rapid response, asset forfeiture from convicted kidnappers, victim reparations, tighter sentencing, and prosecution of corrupt officials. He addressed a graduating class of police cadets. He gave press interviews. He led protests. The state government brought in Colombian security consultants. This decision, the decision to keep pushing, would not be forgiven. Early on July 7, 2009, 4 trucks were filmed by toll booth cameras on the road outside Galeana. 2 stopped at the cemetery. 2 pickups carrying 15 to 20 heavily armed men in helmets, blue uniforms, and bulletproof vests drove to Benjamin's house. They smashed the windows and demanded he open the door while his children cried inside. They beat him in front of his family and threatened his wife unless he revealed the location of a weapons cache. But as one of his brothers later told reporters, Benjamin did not have any weapons, because if he had, he would have used them to protect his family. When Benjamin's brother-in-law, Luis Carlos Widmar Stubbs, 29 years old and known as Wiso, ran across the street to help, the gunman beat him and forced him into the truck alongside Benjamin. Both men were driven roughly 10 minutes outside of town and shot. The killers left a sign at the scene. It read, that this was for the leaders of LeBaron who did not believe and who still did not believe. Benjamin left a wife and 5 sons. Wiso left 4 sons and a daughter. The funeral on July 9th drew thousands. Soldiers stood guard outside. Benjamin's brother Marco, a college student, told reporters that all they wanted was to live in peace, that they wanted nothing to do with the drug cartels, that the cartels could not be stopped, and that all they wanted was to protect themselves from being kidnapped and killed. Mexico's federal government granted SOS Chihuahua unprecedented permission to arm 70 community members in a rural police force. The Chihuahua State Attorney General attributed the killings to La Línea, the Juarez cartel's enforcement arm, operating through its Los Linces Sicario unit. The murders took place in the middle of the Sinaloa-Juarez War for control of the Galeana Casas Grandes Janos smuggling corridor. José Antonio Acosta Hernández, known as El Diego, the La Línea boss who confessed to ordering at least 1,500 killings, including the Vilas de Salvarcar massacre and the 2010 Juarez car bomb, was arrested on July 29, 2011. He was extradited to the United States and sentenced by a federal judge to 7 concurrent life terms, plus 3 additional consecutive life terms, plus 20 years. But no one has ever been convicted of Benjamin LeBaron's murder itself. His brother Julian told an interviewer in 2019 that some of the men responsible still threaten the family, and that the men who carried out the killing were never caught. Benjamin's death became a touchstone for the Chihuahua security debate over the next decade. His brother Julian joined Javier Sicilia's peace movement in 2011 and became one of its national faces. His brother Alex became a Chihuahua state deputy. Then, on November 4, 2019, in what observers consider the direct sequel to Benjamin's murder, La Línea gunmen ambushed 3 SUVs carrying LeBaron Langford Johnson women and children near Bavispe on the Sonora-Chihuahua border. 3 mothers and 6 children were killed. Mexican authorities said the gunmen had mistaken the convoy for a rival Sinaloa Cartel faction. The LeBaron family rejected the mistaken identity theory entirely. By March of 2021, more than 20 La Línea members had been arrested in connection with the massacre. In January of 2025, a federal judge ordered the Attorney General's office to investigate the 2019 massacre as terrorism. Julian LeBaron announced in 2025 that he would run for governor of Chihuahua as an independent in 2027. The family that the cartel tried to silence in 2009 is still refusing to be quiet 16 years later, in a state where silence is the price of survival and speaking costs you everything. 7 cases. 7 lives the Sinaloa Cartel tried to erase. Some got justice, some got nothing, and the cartel is still operating. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.